evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. The arrival of the Chinese coronavirus has killed tens of thousands of Americans and put tens of millions more out of work, really hurt the economy badly. But the crisis has also forced to the center serious conversations about issues that matter to the future of the country. Issues like the dangerous rise of Chinese global dominance, the porousness of our domestic borders, this country's crumbling infrastructure, government corruption and incompetence. We're talking about all of this. Over the past 2 months, you may have asked yourself, why weren't we talking about these things before? They're important. Well, that's a good question, and there's a simple answer to it. The answer is we didn't have time. There was no time to consider the fundamental health of America because we were busy talking about Russia. In Washington, Russia is all we talked about for 3 years. All normal business in the capital city came to a halt as we embarked on a bizarre scavenger hunt in search of Vladimir Putin's spies. Even at the time, the whole thing seemed absurd. Now we know it was worse than absurd. This wasn't, in fact, what we thought it was, history's longest episode of mass hysteria. It was instead an elaborate and intentional hoax staged by the most unscrupulous and power-mad political operatives this country has ever seen. Sound like overstatement? How do we know that? Because they have admitted it. Yesterday, the House Intelligence Committee, chaired by Congressman Adam Schiff of California, finally released 57 transcripts of testimony delivered to the committee behind closed doors, all of it during the Russia investigation. What do those transcripts reveal? We're not going to ask you to trust us on this one. It's too important. So instead, we're going to quote directly from the transcripts. Jim Clapper, Obama's director of national intelligence, said this, quote, "I never saw any direct empirical evidence that the Trump campaign or someone in it was plotting or conspiring with the Russians to meddle with the election." End quote. Compare that to his Twitter feed. Former UN Ambassador Samantha Power, meanwhile, was asked by the committee if she had any evidence of collusion with the Russians. She replied this way, quote, "I am not in possession of anything. I'm not in possession and didn't read or absorb information that came out of the intelligence community." End quote. National Security Advisor Susan Rice said this, quote, "I don't recall intelligence that I would consider evidence." Amazing. And here's former Attorney General Loretta Lynch. Lynch was asked if she saw evidence of Russian collusion, and she replied this way, quote, "I do not recall that being briefed up to me." Notice Lynch's word choice here. I do not recall. For 3 years, our entire political system, every television show, every newspaper, all media outlets revolved around the hunt for Russian spies. We were told again and again, in order to justify this, that collusion was the greatest crime ever committed in American history. It was a crime against the state. It undermined our democracy. Yet the Attorney General of the United States, a close friend of the President, Barack Obama's, claims she, quote, "does not recall if she ever received any evidence that any of it was true." If she'd been Roger Stone when she said that, she would have been charged with perjury on the spot. We'd be watching her sentencing right now. But she's not Roger Stone. And of course, Lynch probably thought the transcript of those remarks would never be made public. That was clearly Evelyn Farkas's assumption. Farkas is a former Defense Department official from the Obama administration. She became a fixture, you may remember, on cable television as news outlets scrambled for puppets with legitimate-sounding resumes to push the Russia collusion narrative. Dumb people who would say anything. And in those categories, Farkas delivered in spades. Here she was in March of 2017.
I was urging my former colleagues and frankly speaking, the people on the Hill, it was more actually aimed at telling the Hill people, get as much information as you can, get as much intelligence as you can before President Obama leaves the administration, because I had a fear that somehow that information would disappear with the senior people who left. So it would be hidden away in the bureaucracy, that the Trump folks, if they found out how we knew what we knew about the Trump staff's dealing with Russians, that they would try to compromise those sources and methods, meaning we would no longer have access to that intelligence. So I became very worried because not enough was coming out into the open, and I knew that there was more. We have very good intelligence on Russia. Yeah,
Mark
that's why you have the leaking.
Exactly.
People are worried.
We have very good intelligence on Russia, quote, said Dr. Evelyn Farkas. She can't take your appendix out, by the way. She's not that kind of doctor. We knew what we knew. But she didn't know anything. Farkas was lying as purely as a liar can lie. Once under oath behind closed doors, Farkas admitted that. Quote, "I didn't know anything," she said. It was all lies, literally all of it, even the core claims about hacking that formed the basis of the entire story and the investigation that followed. In 2016, during the campaign, someone stole information from the DNC's email server. It wound up online and embarrassed Hillary Clinton. Democrats quickly blamed that theft on Russian agents and therefore Donald Trump, who, needless to say, was their pawn. In fact, there was never real evidence that that actually happened. The DNC, you'll remember, never allowed federal investigators to inspect their email servers. That's odd behavior for people who claim to be the victims of foreign espionage. Instead, the party servers were inspected by a third-party company called CrowdStrike. All of this coming back to you? Well, at the time, Adam Schiff's committee interviewed the CEO of CrowdStrike, Sean Henry. Schiff questioned Henry directly, personally. He asked if Henry knew when the Russians had stolen the data. Henry's reply, which we're seeing for the first time, is this, quote, "As it relates to the DNC, we have indicators that data was exfiltrated. We did not have concrete evidence." We did not have concrete evidence. Later, Henry admitted he had only, quote, "circumstantial evidence that the Russians were involved at all." Adam Schiff heard those words directly. He heard them from the one person who would know for certain. Schiff knew there was nothing substantial at the core of the Russian collusion story. At the very center, it was hollow. It was a sham. Schiff never even suggested this in public. Instead, he did the opposite. He spent years on television telling you it was totally real. Shut up.
So there's clear evidence on the issue of collusion, and this adds to that body of evidence. There's ample evidence of collusion in plain sight, and that is true.
Have Democrats found any evidence of collusion?
Yes, we have. You can see evidence in plain sight on the issue of collusion, pretty compelling evidence. And there is significant evidence of collusion. There is ample evidence, and indeed there is, of collusion of people in the Trump campaign with the Russians. I think there's plenty of evidence of collusion or conspiracy. All of this is evidence of collusion. There is significant evidence of collusion between the campaign and Russia.
In case you weren't counting during that montage, Adam Schiff said evidence 9 times, and every single time he was lying. And it was fairly obvious at the time if you were following closely. Schiff never produced any of the so-called evidence that the DNC server, or by the way, John Podesta's email, were hacked by the Russian government. Several times on the show, we raised the question, do we really know this? A group of retired intelligence officers wrote a long piece saying, actually, that didn't happen, and here's how we know. And we brought that up on the show. We came under enormous pressure to be quiet. You're crazy. We know that for a fact, but we didn't know it for a fact. And when Schiff came on this show, we asked him, how exactly do you know this? He never answered our question. Instead, he accused us of treason. Look right into the camera and say, I know for a fact the government of Vladimir Putin was behind the hacks of John Podesta's email.
Absolutely. The government of Vladimir Putin was behind the hacks of our institution and the dumping of information.
Of John Podesta's email.
Not only in the
of
United
John Podesta's
States,
email.
but also in Europe.
Okay, you're not, you know what, you're dodging.
And Tucker,
no, look and say, I know they did. John Podesta's emails, they hacked those.
And I think that Ronald Reagan will be rolling over his grave at your carrying water for the Kremlin.
I'm not carrying water for the, you're a sitting member of Congress on the Intel Committee, and you can't say they hacked.
You're gonna have to move your show to RT Russian television.
A normal person would not behave that way, could not behave that way. Conscience would prevent it. Adam Schiff is a sociopath. He will do or say anything to achieve power. He is unfit to hold office. He should resign. And not just Adam Schiff. The entire apparatus of official Washington has been exposed by these transcripts, as well as by the documents just released in the Michael Flynn case we went over last night. In November of 2019, government attorney Brendan Van Grack defended the FBI's decision to interrogate Flynn at the White House with no lawyer. Van Grack said this, quote, the FBI was engaged in a legitimate and significant investigation into whether individuals associated with the campaign of then-candidate Donald J. Trump were coordinating with the Russian government. In that same filing, Van Grack wrote that Flynn's phone call with the Russian ambassador, the now famous Kislyak, was of central importance. Quote, it was imperative that the FBI determine whether and why such communications with the Russian ambassador had occurred. Both of those statements from Van Grack, we now know conclusively, are lies. In its filing this week, the DOJ revealed that in early January, the FBI had already known that there was, quote, no derogatory information tying Michael Flynn to the Russian government. Nor did they need to know whether Flynn had spoken with Ambassador Kislyak. They knew for a fact he had because they were listening at the time. They had a word-for-word transcript of the call. In other words, Van Grack was lying in his filing. Now, this is not only of importance to Donald Trump, the people who work for him, or those who voted for Donald Trump. This is important to every American because things fall apart quickly when high-level officials do things like this for political reasons. Look around. Do you know anybody who trusts the government anymore? There's a reason for that, and it's not good. It's things like this. And by the way, it's not just Democrats you should blame for the corrosion of our public life. The vast majority of the Russian collusion investigation, including the testimony you just heard, the clips we just played, occurred during the first 2 years of this administration. Who ran the government then? At the time, Republicans controlled both houses of Congress and every single committee by definition. They had the power to expose this hoax and to shut it down, but they did not. We can only speculate as to why they did not. Perhaps they were too cowardly to tell the truth, or maybe deep down, a lot of them agreed with the aims of all of this. Either way, it'll be very interesting, and we're going to sit back and enjoy it, as Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell and Richard Burr and so many of the other useless Senate Republicans, the total phonies who tell you they're representing you but don't, explain why they didn't really do anything to stop the derailment of America while it was in progress.